Welcome to our video on Locke concerning personal identity. So in this segment of the video, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about his theory of knowledge, because you're not going to be able to understand his theory of when things are the same or how they're individuated from other things until you understand his theory on how we know these things. And so Locke is what we call an empiricist. And an empiricist is someone who believes that all our knowledge comes strictly through the senses. And Locke believes we have the five senses, but that we also have an internal sense, which he calls reflection. In other words, this inability not just to see the outer world, but to sense our own inner mental states. So now his argument against the ideas that Descartes gave us, that rationalism is the basis for knowledge, that reason gives us the basis for knowledge, all have to do with this question of what we call innate ideas. So what are innate ideas? They're ideas that, or pieces of knowledge that we are born with, you might say. Okay. Plato was the first one to bring up this idea that we can't get to know anything without first having some kind of knowledge. And the reason why is because Plato argued that whenever we come to know something, we don't just come to have a new belief, but we have to be able to justify that belief. And to justify it means to base it on something we already know and that it follows from what we already know. And so any learning presupposes knowledge. But Aristotle, his student, argued, no, it doesn't presupposing knowing that something is true. It presupposes having certain skills, certain know-how. And this is what Locke jumps off of. He first wants to argue that the rationalist is wrong, that we do not have knowledge to start with, that we're not born with knowledge. And his main argument is what we're going to rehearse right now. So how does that argument go? Well, first, what he wants to say is that if we did have innate ideas, if we were born with knowledge, then everyone would be aware of them. Okay, what he means by everyone is every single human being, no matter what, because the idea behind innate knowledge is as a human being, when I'm born and I come to a certain stage of development, those ideas come into my mind and I have them. And for us to have an idea, Locke says, is for us to be aware of it, because you cannot have ideas you're not aware of, because ideas are pieces of consciousness, and consciousness is something you're conscious of. Otherwise, it's not consciousness. So he says that if we have these innate ideas as humans, then every single human should be aware of it and should agree to these ideas when made known to them. In other words, when pointed out to them. So what are the candidates? Well, for innate ideas, the most obvious candidate is the principle of non-contradiction, the principle that something cannot both be and not be at the same time. Something cannot both have a characteristic and not have a characteristic at the same time. And so Locke uses that as a candidate example. And he says, look, if you look around the world, if you talk to children, if you talk to those who have severe intellectual disabilities, still humans, you will find not only do they not understand the idea, but many would even not assent to it, not agree with that, and actually say a contradiction could be true. So he argues that there are no ideas that everyone in every culture and every type of human being assents to. And therefore, that's proof, he argues, that we do not have any ideas that we're all born with and that we all agree to. So what does that mean? Well, that means that therefore, all our knowledge, since we start off as what you might call a blank slate, he calls it a tabula rasa in the Latin. Because we start off with no knowledge whatsoever, it follows that the knowledge is in us, it must come to us. And the only way it could possibly come to us is through the ways in which we have contact with the outside world, with the truth, and that's through our senses. So besides these five senses, we said, we have this ability to sense our internal states, reflection. And this is how we're going to learn not only about the outside world, but about ourselves, what types of beings we are, and what does it take for us to continue to exist? This whole question of personal identity. So, as we said, we have this ability to identify and distinguish. And again, an ability to identify and distinguish and an ability to see, oh, that's right or that's wrong through reason is not knowledge, he argues. Just like knowing how to ride a bike isn't the same thing as knowing what the theory is and being able to explain it to people. So many animals, for example, know how to distinguish enemies from foe, but they have no concept of that. They don't therefore have knowledge of the difference between their enemies and their foes. But human beings have this unique ability that when we sense something, we sense that some things are the same and some things are different. And he calls this the ability to identify and distinguish our ideas and to be conscious of those samenesses and differences. And now when you link this with the idea that we have a memory, then we can compare ideas at different times and thus come to judgments about whether we are perceiving the same thing or a different thing at a different time. So this then becomes the basis for some truths that we're going to use to then determine for anything, what is it to be identical with that thing and what is it to be different from that thing. And thus, for Locke, we can't just simply ask the question, what is it to be identical or different? We have to ask for each type of thing, what is it? And that's going to give us a different answer as to what will it be its principles for what we might say individuation, and what will be its principle for continuation. So, but first, let's talk about the most general ideas behind identity, he says, that we get from our senses. And we're going to start not with what causes things to continue over time, because we have to first talk about what makes a thing at any particular time. So identity at a time. So we said that because we come to these ideas of identity through this ability to see that things are the same, okay, then we come to know that things exist. Maybe, for example, a desk or this computer or something, and we perceive its existence. That's the first basis. And we perceive that it occupies a certain place, right? And we also perceive that things are different. And we do that again through having a different perception. This doesn't look like this. And so that's, it sounds very common sense, but he says we got to start at that common sense area where we see some things and we see it's the same. And we look at other things and we see that the perception is different. So what follows from these really simple duh ideas is that bodies occupying different positions at a single time are going to be distinct with each other. Okay? In other words, if I perceive two identical iron balls, say, sitting on a table, and why do I perceive them as two? Well, because they're occupying different positions, which means that no matter how much they look alike in themselves, they still have a difference that I perceive, and that's a difference in position. And that very difference, the slightest difference, means they're not the same. And so it's obvious that even if I could perceive two identical raindrops as far as their qualities are concerned internally without paying attention to anything else, precisely because I also perceive them on the same visual field to be occupying distinct positions, then there is a distinction between them. And since identity is about absolute sameness of perception and distinction is about difference in perception, it will follow that I'm having perception of two distinct objects. Thus, bodies occupying two distinct positions are distinct. Obvious. But also, the opposing kind of thing is true. it will follow that if I perceive I'm looking at a table, and on that table is this iron ball, that what I'm perceiving is a single iron ball. I am perceiving a single object. No two things of the same kind, no two bodies can occupy the same position at the same time. Well, why? Well, because we couldn't ever possibly perceive a difference in these supposed two. Let's say, for example, we thought, okay, really, even though I'm seeing this hunk of matter occupying this position, this hunk of matter really is two distinct bodies occupying the exact same position. The question is, how would I be able to tell? They're exactly the same. The perception is exactly the same. And since the basis for my knowledge is the perception, it would follow that if I believe there's two there, then there's nothing preventing me from saying there's three or four or an infinite number of them. It's impossible for two bodies of the same type to occupy the same position, because for them to occupy the same position at the same time is for them to have exactly the same appearance, exactly all the same qualities, and I would never be able to distinguish the two of them. And thus, they're the same. So you might say these two truths, that bodies occupying different positions are distinct from each other, and bodies occupying the same position are the same as each other, will be the basis for how we tell identity at any particular time. Because it is from there that we then say things continue to exist or they don't. So now let's talk about identity over time. Before I do that, let's draw a little diagram on the board so you can understand it a little better. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second. Okay. So let's look here. Let us say we have a body. And let us say that we have a certain time that the body is occupying a certain position. Okay. Now, what we want to say is, since there is one perception of something occupying one position, that's exactly one body, and it's identical to itself. It's self-same. All right. Well, then what will constitute its continuation over time is that as time goes on, that body remains the same. It continues to exist in the exact same state with no change. Because the only way we could perceive difference is if a change were to occur. And so we're taking this sort of what we call base case, and we're saying that as long as no change occurs, then the same thing is there. Since when we compare our idea or our perception of the body at time 1, it's going to equal our perception of the body at time 2. And when we compare it with time 3, it's going to equal also. There's no change. And since when we compare ideas over time and see that they're the same, occupying the same position with no change in qualities at all, then we are going to unavoidably judge that the body has continued to exist from time 1 to time 3. Just that common sense. So the question is, well, what if the body changes? Does that mean it goes out of existence? That's where what we have to do is talk about different types of substances, he says. Now, it's really important to understand what he means, Locke, by the word substance. Okay, he's literally taking it for its original Latin meaning. There's two parts to the word substance. There's the part sub, which means under, and stance, right? To stand, to underlie, right? So Really, it's just the underlying stuff that we then say has certain qualities, okay? So thus different substances are going to have different definitions of what they are, and thus will tell us what it is to be them. And that definition will then tell us what it is to continue to be the same thing over time. So let's go back to the PowerPoint, because he's going to start with the simplest kind of substance, what he's going to call an atom. Okay. Now, when you and I think of atoms, we think of little planetary systems with protons and neutrons, the nucleus and electrons around it somehow. That's not the original meaning of the word atom. Okay. An atom just comes from the Greek word atome, which means to be uncuttable. In other words, a substance with no parts. So you might say it's a smallest possible substance that can't be broken down into anything more simple. It's an absolutely partless thing, right? Or body. So let's go back to screen sharing here. And let's go back to our ideas of these simple bodies. Okay. So, as we said, all we're going to mean by identity, continued identity, since things can't occupy more than one place at a time, and whatever occupies a single thing is just whatever hunk of matter occupies a single position is just a single thing. It can't be multiple things being coextensive with each other. And so since what we mean by identity is this continuation of perception over time, over at future times, then we're going to start with this sort of simple case scenario, because we're going to be able to apply the principle when we build up to more complex objects. So we're going to define, first of all, the simplest kind of object, which is this partless atom. So we see that the atom is just what it is. It's this partless thing, and we're going to assume that's it right there. That's the atom. And it's the same as itself as it begins to exist. There aren't two things there. Anything that occupies the exact same position as the atom would be that atom by our first principle. And guess what? Its principle of continuation just as continued existence, right? Because it can't break down. It can't add parts to it without being something more complex. And so since there can be no change in a partless thing, because any change would involve some part of it being different than before, and atoms don't have parts, then it would follow that for it to exist over time is just for it to continue to exist, just to be the same atom over time. For it to go out of existence is for it to entirely go out of existence. For it to come into existence, it can't do it gradually since it doesn't have parts. And so therefore, its principle of existence, its definition tells us that just as existence guarantees its continuity. Okay. But of course, most things in the universe aren't atoms. They're made up of atoms, you might say. And so now what we want to do is go to the next kind of thing, which is hunks of stuff. Just simply, you might say hunks of marble, hunks of matter. They are what you say They're bunches of atoms. That's what he means by a body. A bunch of atoms joined together in a single place. So now what we want to do is think of that like that. So we can go like that. Pretend they're joined together. Okay, and let's just number them. Let's say, thus we have a body. Now, when does the body come into existence? Well, this particular body would only be in existence as long as 1, 2, 3, and 4 were all together in a single place. And since you can't have more than one body occupying, having the exact same parts, occupying the exact same position, then this is our body right there. This is our hunk of matter. And for it to continue to exist is just for it to continue to have all the atoms joined together in the same place. It could move around. The body itself could move around. You could imagine it going at time 2 to a different place. But as long as all of them are still joined together, then it's the same body. So what would make it become a different body? Well, if say it lost one of the atoms, then it would go out of existence, because what it is for it to be this particular body is for it to be this particular bunch of stuff. Lose the slightest amount of it, and you don't have that stuff, the same stuff anymore. Or for it to gain some new stuff. So let's say in time 3, it now has 5 atoms joined together. So now we have a bigger body. And this body has gone out of existence. So we see that everything depends on what kind of thing we're talking about. Atoms, the only way they can go out of existence is not through change. They just have to either be completely extinguished, or for them to come into existence, pop into existence, because there's no parts, nothing to break down, nothing to add to. And when we get to anything that's made up of those atoms that are just simply bodies, just hunks of stuff like rocks, then because they're defined as simply the joining together in one place of all those atoms, then it follows that when all of them are together, that's the beginning of their existence, and the end of that body's existence is the slightest alteration of any matter in that body, changing or adding. So, thus we see that for each particular type of thing, we have to have a certain idea of it. And that idea tells us what it is for it to be it and not something else, and tells us what it means for it to continue and remain the same thing. We use our senses to determine this, and our senses tell us when things are the same or different by comparing with what we perceived in the past through our memory. So that's hunks of stuff. So now we want to get to things that are more complex, right? Things that are more than simply hunks of matter, and that's organized hunks of matter, you might say, organisms. And so now we come to a thing called plants, okay? The key here with a plant, and with any organism, he's going to argue further on, is that they are defined not simply by all of their atoms or the matter that they're constituted of being in one place, but actually through the way the matter comes together in a particular type of active organization, okay? Plants are living things. And for Locke, for something to be living is for it to be an active organization, an organization kind of like a machine, but having its principle of movement or activity inside itself. Now, plants don't move, but they have internal operations, and these internal operations basically serve to what? To make the plant grow, take in new matter, and grow, and then reproduce. And so thus, what is a plant? It's just this organization of body parts that actively working to take in nourishment and grow. So since that's what a plant is, then we will know, say an oak, right? That it's going to be something that's composed of certain types of atoms that come together to take in matter from the outside world to form things like wood and plant cells and leaves and all of these things that come together into a particular type of organization. So as long as that organization then continues, then the plant continues. And what does that mean? Well, that means that actually, unlike hunks of matter, a plant will be able to continue as the same plant as long as that organization is the same. It will be able to lose matter and atoms, and it will be able to take in atoms into that organization. So you can kind of think of it as long as the organization remains intact, then any slight changes and slow, subtle, gradual changes will not make the plant go out of existence. The plant will continue to exist as long as the changes and the additions and deletions of matter in the plant are gradual. That's crucial because what would happen if all of a sudden at one time all of the matter of the plant was extinguished and then replaced with some other matter? Well, then since the organization is the organization of those particular parts, what that would mean is that the plant itself was extinguished, because you don't have something being brought into an already existing organization instead, or something leaving an already existing organization. You have the entire organization being radically changed. And even if a new plant, which looked exactly like it, would be replace that plant, because what was replaced is actually a new set of matter organized in the same way, it wouldn't be the same plant. So the key here to plants' continued existence is that changes have to be gradual and in such a way that the original organization isn't destroyed, but each new thing that comes into it or leaves it assimilates into the same organization, the same principle of activity. Because otherwise, as we said, if it became too radical, then what would happen is you wouldn't have the same organization, since an organization is just an arrangement of the entire set of parts. Take away all the parts at once, and even if you bring in something exactly the same, it's a bunch of different pieces of matter with exactly the same type of organization, you destroyed the original organization, and now you're replacing it with a different one. So that's the principle of identity for plants. And what's interesting about this is once you understand that this is true for plants, it's going to be true for any kind of entity that is just simply an organization of parts. And thus, we understand why two things can't have, nothing can have two beginnings, right? So this is another reason why, for example, if you completely destroy or take away all of the parts at once and then bring them back together again, you're not going to have the same plant, because you would have two beginnings, and nothing can have two beginnings. All right, so now let's go to animals. What makes for identity of animals is going to be exactly the same, he says. Because again, an animal is still an organism, and an organism is still an organization of material parts that take together nourishment just like the plants, but have this additional characteristic. What makes an animal, when way back to Aristotle, is that unlike plants, animals can move. Now, plants can move, it's true, but they have to be moved in order to move. My wife has this hibiscus plant that she loves that I got her for her anniversary like about 16 years ago, and it still survived. Every year we have to take it into the garage for winter because we're in Georgia and it has 4 seasons, and if we leave it out, it will die. So the plant can't move itself. We have to take it and move it, which gets harder every year because it's bigger and we have to have a bigger pot. But if the plant, that hibiscus, were an animal, we wouldn't need to move it. It would move itself. That's exactly where the word animal comes from. It means that which is animated, which can move on its own. So an animal is just a certain type of machine, living machine that has an organization that takes in nourishment like plants and grows, but also can move on its own. It has its own principle of motion, which originates from within the animal rather than being moved by something else. So it stands to reason that the same principle of identities will apply, right? That what makes an animal, the beginning of an animal, the same is when that organization comes together and comes into existence with the matter that it has, that's its beginning. And then how it continues to exist is the fact that that organization continues on despite gradual changes in the material that makes up the organization. So we then come to humans. And humans, it stands to reason, will have the exact same principle of identity. Now, you have to be careful here. What he means by a human is simply an animal of a certain type. All of us will agree from Aristotle all the way till today that humans are just a certain type of animal. And as an animal, they are an organization of body parts that take in nourishment and move on their own. They just have different kinds of characteristics than dogs or other things. They have additional characteristics, but what makes humans an animal are the same. And therefore, humans are just this particular type of complex body. And that complex body is going to be defined in a certain biological structure. And as long as that structure and organization and activity remains the same, then it can survive changes in the material that makes that body up, as long as, again, it's gradual. So Locke is very interesting in that what this would mean is, for those of you who are big science fiction treks, Star Trek fans and stuff like that, that if you've ever heard of a thing called a transporter in the old like Star Trek, you would be able to be beamed down to a planet. But how would that happen? Well, according to the mechanism, what it would do is break you down into all of your constituent molecules and then shoot you in those molecules in a beam to whatever place you were going, and then compile those molecules into the organic structure, the identical organic structure that was yours. But what would that mean? Well, that would mean that you actually were destroyed at that point because the changes weren't gradual. They were all at once, and thus the organization was destroyed at one time. Thus, what was reconstituted, even though it has all the same molecules, because it's now not the same organization, is not the same human. And so what Locke would advise you to do is not get into that transporter, because it would destroy you as a human being. Okay? So what we see here is a very interesting thing. Locke seems to be telling us that what it is to be human and what it is to be a person aren't necessarily the same thing. Okay? Now you might say, yeah, but isn't it what I am really a matter of my soul and not my body, as Descartes has argued? Well, here's the problem with that, he says. Because if it's just sameness of your soul that constitutes your continued existence as a human being, okay, this is crucial, as a human being, then what would follow from that is that because the soul, there's no logical necessity that it occupy the same body, then it could be possible that my dog Titus is really the same human as Caesar, as Julius Caesar. Why? Well, because maybe Julius Caesar, when he died, the body died, then his soul migrated into my dog. And if being the same human means having the same soul, then it would follow that my dog Titus and Caesar are the same, not just same being, but the same human, which is impossible. So since what it is to be human is to be a certain type of animal, then it can't be the soul that determines our humanity. That's crucial. So here the crucial thing is that he's distinguishing between you and I as humans versus you and I as persons, as conscious beings. And what that will mean, what we're going to see next week, is that it will be possible for you to be the same person over time, but maybe a different human. Perhaps even your personhood survives and you become a dog. Everything depends on what it is to be the same person and what it is to be a person. And he wants to make clear that since what it is to be a human being involves being a certain type of animal, that it can't have anything to do with having a certain personal consciousness or soul. When you understand that, what that will tell you is that Aristotle's old definition of what is it to be human, being a rational animal, is an incorrect definition. We are not, doesn't mean that we're not rational, that most humans aren't rational, and that we're not animals. Obviously, we're animals of a certain type of biological structure, and that biological structure gives us these abilities, you might say, to be rational. He's not contesting that at all. What he's arguing is that that can't be part of our definition to be rational. Well, why? Well, think of it like this. You could conceive of, in fact, there are plenty of human beings like this, who have beings that have the exact same DNA structure, exact same 23 sets of chromosomes, right? 36 chromosomes, same genetic code, same biological structure, but let's say they had the intelligence of a cat or a cow, severely mentally disabled. Would that make them not human? Obviously not. They would just be humans that aren't rational. And he says, we would all know that we would still, if we saw a being like that, we would say, that's a human being. So it can't be being rational that makes us human. That can't be part of our definition. And indeed, there might be rational animals that are not human, that are more rational than us, are biological beings, but are obviously not human because they don't share our biological structure, like say aliens. And he brings up the example of maybe a really intelligent parrot, or if we could teach gorillas to speak as we have, and they have a certain level of rationality as a result. We wouldn't say because they're rational animals that therefore they're human. So let us sum up here the basic principles of identity that he has given us. First, the key to remember is that this is a theory that's totally based on sameness and difference. And what we mean by sameness and difference is perceived sameness, perceived difference. He says that's the only hold we have on what it means to be an individual that's distinct from other individuals at a certain time. And it's the only hold we have on what it would mean for an individual to continue to exist. For an individual to continue to exist is just for it to be perceived to be the same, that there is some aspect of it that continues to be perceived to be the same. If every aspect of the individual was perceived to be different from what it was before, then it can't be the same individual. So we apply that then to different types of things. Things that are simple are just going to be the things that remain the same completely over time. That's how they continue to exist. Things that are complex will then be defined by what it is about their complexity that makes them this particular individual. Bodies are hunks of stuff, and so what makes them continue is they're the same bunch of atoms together. Take any away, they're not the same. Organisms are organizations. And so what makes them the same over time is continuation of that organization despite changes of things coming in and out of the organization. The only thing that could destroy them is a complete breakdown at a rapid time, the same time of the entire organization. And since humans are animals and organizations just like that, then the same principles of identity apply to us. But our next question is, what about persons? Persons, says Locke, are not bodies. They might depend on bodies, they might be constituted by their bodies, but what defines a person is this idea of consciousness. And so we need to then discuss what it is for the same consciousness to continue over time. And we'll do that next time.